He woke up in a mansion he didn't recognize, wearing clothes that cost more than his entire life, and the lawyer sitting across from him said 3 words that shattered everything he thought he knew about himself. "You re the Heir." But 24 hours earlier, Jamal was sleeping on a couch in the projects with holes in his shoes and 53 cents in his pocket. And so how did a kid who couldn't afford lunch suddenly inherit a fortune worth millions? And why did everyone in his life lie to him about who he really was? Jamal Carter grew up in the Riverside projects on the south side, where gunshots were the neighborhood alarm clock and hope was something people talked about but never actually had. His mother died when he was 7 years old. A quiet woman who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't keep the lights on. And after she passed, Jamal bounced between his grandmother's apartment and the homes of whoever would take him in for a few weeks at a time. His grandmother, Miss Ruby, raised him the best she could on a Social Security check that barely covered groceries. And she taught him 2 things that stuck with him every single day: work harder than everyone else and never let them see you cry. Jamal followed those rules religiously, waking up at 5 in the morning to deliver newspapers before school, staying late at the community center to tutor younger kids for $5 an hour, and still maintaining a 3.8 GPA. He knew education was the only ticket out of the projects. He was 17 years old, a senior at Riverside High, and everyone who knew him said the same thing: that kid's going to make it out, that kid's different, that kid's got something special inside him that can't be crushed by the weight of poverty. But life in the projects has a way of reminding you that hope is expensive and survival is exhausting. And Jamal felt that weight every single day when he walked past the corner where his best friend Marcus got shot 2 years ago, or when he saw his grandmother taking pills for her heart condition that she could barely afford, or when he looked down at his shoes with the sole peeling off and remembered that he'd been wearing the same pair for 3 years. The pain wasn't just physical, it was the kind of deep ache that settles into your bones when you realize that no matter how hard you work, the world has already decided what your life is worth. And for a black kid from the projects, that worth was usually measured in nothing. Jamal carried that pain silently, the way his grandmother taught him, never complaining, never asking for help, just pushing forward because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant becoming another statistic in a neighborhood full of them. He worked the morning shift at the newspaper, went to school, tutored kids in the afternoon, studied until midnight, and then collapsed on the couch in his grandmother's living room because his bedroom was really just a closet with a mattress on the floor, and even in sleep, he dreamed of something more, something bigger, something that felt impossible but necessary. Then one morning, everything changed in the strangest way possible, a way that made no sense and seemed like a cruel joke at first. Jamal was walking to school, cutting through the alley behind the old Baptist church, when a black car pulled up beside him, sleek and expansive, the kind of car that didn't belong in this neighborhood unless someone was about to get hurt. The window rolled down, and a white man in a suit leaned out, his expression serious but not threatening, and he said, "Jamal Carter." Jamal's first instinct was to run because nothing good ever came from strangers in expensive cars asking your name in the projects, but something in the man's voice made him stop a certain formality, a sense that this wasn't a threat but something else entirely. The man stepped out of the car, straightened his tie, and said, "My name is Richard Holloway. I'm an attorney with Holloway and Associates, and I need you to come with me right now because there is something you need to know about your family." Jamal laughed a bitter sound because family was a joke in his life. He had a grandmother and a bunch of distant cousins he barely knew, and the idea that any of them had business with a lawyer in a suit that probably cost more than Miss Ruby's rent was absurd. But Richard Holloway didn't laugh. He just opened the car door and said, "Please, Jamal, this concerns your mother, and it's time you learned the truth." The mention of his mother froze Jamal in place because nobody talked about her, not even Miss Ruby. It was like she'd been erased from existence the moment she died. And now the stranger was standing in the alley, saying her name like he knew her, like she mattered. Jamal got in the car, his heart pounding, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. And as they drove out of the projects and into parts of the city he'd only seen on television, Richard explained that there were things about Jamal's mother that had been kept secret. Things that would change everything he thought he knew about his life. They pulled up to a mansion. Not just a nice house, but an actual mansion with gates and a fountain and windows that sparkled in the morning sun. And Jamal felt his stomach twist because this couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of mistake or scam or dream. Richard led him inside, through marble hallways and rooms filled with furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, and finally into a library where an older black man sat in a leather chair, his face weathered but dignified, his eyes filled with something that looked like regret and relief all mixed together. The man stood up slowly, his hands trembling slightly, and he said, "Jamal, my name is William Blackwell, and I'm your grandfather." Jamal felt the words hit him like a physical blow because his grandfather was supposed to be dead. That's what everyone told him. Both sides of his family were gone except for Miss Ruby, but here was this man, alive and wealthy and claiming a connection that Jamal didn't understand. William Blackwell walked closer, his voice soft but steady, and he explained that Jamal's mother, Sarah, was his only daughter, and that she had left this life, this wealth, this entire world behind when she was 20 years old, because she fell in love with a man William didn't approve of, a man from the projects. Jamal's father, William, had given Sarah an ultimatum: live that man or lose her family, and Sarah chose love over money, walked away from a fortune, and never looked back. Jamal felt anger rising in his chest because this man, this stranger, was telling him that his mother had been rich, that she could have given him a life without hunger and fear and worn-out shoes. But instead, she chose poverty, and he didn't know if that made her a hero or a fool. William continued, his voice breaking slightly, explaining that he regretted his decision every single day after Sarah left, that he hired investigators to find her, but she disappeared completely, changed her name, lived quietly in the projects, and by the time he finally tracked her down, she had already passed away from an illness that could have been treated if she had access to proper health care, and that guilt had haunted William for 10 years. He looked at Jamal with tears in his eyes and said, "I lost my daughter because of my pride, and I won't lose my grandson too. You're the heir to the Blackwell estate. Everything I built was supposed to be hers, and now it's yours." Jamal wanted to scream, wanted to run, wanted to punch something, because how dare this man show up now? How dare he offer money and man chance after Jamal and his mother and his grandmother had suffered 4 years after his mother died because she couldn't afford medicine. After Jamal wore shoes with holes and went to bed hungry and worked himself to exhaustion just to survive. Richard, a lawyer, pulled out documents, legal papers that proved everything. William was saying birth certificates and DNA tests and a will that named Jamal as the sole beneficiary of an estate worth $47 million. And the number was so absurd, so impossibly large, that Jamal couldn't even process it. He spent that first night in the mansion, but he didn't sleep. He just sat on the edge of a bed that was bigger than his grandmother S's entire living room, and stared at his phone, looking at pictures of the projects of Miss Ruby, of the life he knew, and he felt like he was betraying something fundamental by being here. In the morning, William took him on a tour of the estate, showing him the businesses he owned, the investments, the properties, and explaining that all of this would be Jamal's when he turned 80, which was only 3 months away. Jamal listened, nodded, said nothing, because what do you say when your entire reality has been rewritten overnight, when you go from broke to wealthy, from invisible to important, from a kid nobody cared about to an heir everyone suddenly wanted to know? He asked William why. Nobody told him why. Miss Ruby never said anything, and William's face darkened as he admitted that Ruby didn't know, that Sarah had cut off all contact with her former life so completely that even her own mother-in-law had no idea where she came from or who her family was. And when Sarah died, she took those secrets with her. Jamal went back to the projects that afternoon, walked into his grandmother's apartment, and found Miss Ruby in the kitchen making collard greens with ham hocks. The smell so familiar and comforting that it made his chest ache. He sat down at the table, the same table where he'd done homework and eaten cereal for dinner and had conversations about dreams that seemed impossible, and he told her everything, every word William had said, every detail about the mansion and the money and the family he never knew existed. Miss Ruby listened in silence, her face unreadable, and when Jamal finished, she put down her spoon, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "Your mama was the bravest woman I ever knew. She gave up everything for love, and she never regretted it, not once. And if she was here right now, she'd tell you that money don't make you rich. Character does." Jamal felt tears streaming down his face because he missed his mother so much. It physically hurt, and he didn't know if he was supposed to accept this inheritance or reject it. Didn't know if taking the money meant betraying her sacrifice or honoring her memory. The next few weeks were the hardest of Jamal's life, harder even than the years of poverty, because at least poverty was familiar. But this new world of wealth and expectations and judgments was completely foreign. He tried to keep going to school, but word spread fast in the projects, and suddenly everyone treated him differently. Some kids were jealous, some were angry, some tried to be his friend only because they wanted something, and Jamal felt more alone than he ever had before. The kids he tutored looked at him like he was a traitor. Like by accepting this money, he was saying their struggle didn't matter. And teachers who used to encourage him now seemed suspicious, like they thought he'd cheated somehow or didn't deserve what he'd been given. William wanted him to move into the mansion permanently, to leave the projects behind and start training to take over the family businesses. But Jamal couldn't do it, couldn't abandon Miss Ruby or forget where he came from. So he split his time between two worlds and felt like he didn't belong in either one. Then came the moment that broke him completely, the moment when hope turned to devastation and Jamal questioned everything. He came home one afternoon to find Miss Ruby collapsed on the kitchen floor, her heart finally giving out after years of stress and medication she couldn't always afford. And as the ambulance rushed her to the hospital, Jamal sat in the waiting room, thinking about how his mother had died the same way, how poverty killed people slowly and quietly, and how if he'd known about this inheritance earlier, he could have gotten Miss Ruby better care, could have saved her. The doctors worked for hours, and when they finally came out, they told Jamal that Miss Ruby had survived, but needed surgery that would cost more than $200,000. Surgery that wasn't fully covered by Medicare. And for the first time in his life, Jamal had the money to save someone he loved. But it felt like a punishment, like the universe was mocking him by making him rich only after the people he cared about had already suffered. He paid for the surgery without hesitation, used money from an account William had set up for him, and as he sat beside Miss Ruby's hospital bed, watching her breathe through tubes and machines, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Jamal realized that this money, this inheritance, wasn't a gift or a curse. It was a responsibility, and he could either let it destroy him with guilt or use it to honor his mother as sacrifice and Miss Ruby as strength. When Miss Ruby woke up 3 days later, weak but alive, Jamal held her hand and told her his plan. Told her he was going to accept the inheritance, but he wasn't going to become one of those rich people who forgot where they came from. He was going to use the money to change the projects, to make sure no other kid had to grow up the way he did. No other grandmother had to choose between medicine and food. No other mother had to work 3 jobs and still die young. Miss Ruby smiled, tears in her eyes, and she said, "That's my boy. That's Sarah's son. You go do what's right." Jamal moved forward with a clarity he'd never felt before, working with William to understand the businesses, learning about investments in real estate and philanthropy. But he did it on his own terms, never forgetting the projects, never pretending he was better than the people he grew up with. He used his money to fund scholarships for kids from Riverside High, to renovate the community center where he used to tutor, to pay for medical care for families who couldn't afford it. And slowly the anger and jealousy from the neighborhood began to fade as people realized Jamal wasn't trying to escape them. He was trying to lift them up. He hired people from the projects to work in his grandfather's companies, giving them opportunities they'd never had before. And he invested in local businesses owned by black families, helping them grow and compete in a system designed to keep them down. William watched all of this with pride and regret, proud of the man Jamal was becoming, regretful that he missed so many years with his daughter and grandson because of his own stubbornness and prejudice. He spent hours thinking about his mother, about the choice she made to leave wealth behind for love, and he realized that she wasn't a fool, she was a revolutionary. A woman who understood that richness wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in relationships, in integrity, in the courage to live according to your values even when the cost was high. Jamal decided to live by that same principle, to use his wealth not as a shield from the world, but as a tool to change it, to honor his mother's memory by being the kind of man she would have been proud of, the kind of man who never forgot his roots. No matter how high he climbed, he graduated from Riverside High as valedictorian, gave a speech about resilience and community that brought the entire auditorium to tears. And when he walked across that stage to receive his diploma, wearing a cap and gown that William had paid for but Miss Ruby had ironed with her own hands, he felt his mother's presence, felt her pride, felt her love wrapping around him like a warm embrace. The day Jamal turned 18, he officially inherited the Blackwell estate, and the first thing he did was establish the Sarah Carter Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing health care, education, and economic opportunities to low-income communities, named after his mother, the woman who gave up everything and gained something far more valuable in return. He brought Miss Ruby to the foundation's opening ceremony, pushed her wheelchair up to the front row, and when he gave his speech, he talked about poverty and privilege, about the randomness of birth and the responsibility of wealth, about how every person deserves dignity and opportunity regardless of where they reborn or what color their skin is. The crowd, a mix of project residents and wealthy donors, William's business associates and Jamal's old teachers, gave him a standing ovation. And in that moment, Jamal understood that his mother's sacrifice hadn't been in vain, that her choice to love openly and live authentically had created a legacy far more powerful than money ever could. William lived for 3 more years, long enough to see Jamal transform the Blackwell empire into something that served people instead of just profiting from them. And before he died, he told Jamal that he spent most of his life chasing wealth, and the last few years realizing it meant nothing without love and family, and that Jamala had taught him what Sarah had tried to teach him decades ago, that some things are more valuable than money, and that legacy is not about what you leave behind, but about how you make people feel while you're here. Jamal held his grandfather's hand as he passed, forgave him for the years of pain and separation, and promised to continue building something that would make both William and Sarah proud. Years later, when Jamal was a young man in his 20s, running multiple businesses and foundations, mentoring hundreds of kids from the projects, he would sometimes drive back to Riverside, park his car outside the building where he grew up, and just sit there, remembering the hunger and the fear and the exhaustion, remembering Marcus and his mother and all the people who didn't make it out. And he would cry, not from sadness, but from gratitude, because he understood now that his journey wasn't about going from broke to rich. It was about going from broken to whole, from lost to found, from a kid who did not know where he came from, to a man who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. The lesson Jamal learned, the lesson he shared with every young person he mentored, was this: your circumstances don't define you. Your choices do. And no matter where you start in life, you have the power to decide where you end up, not just financially, but spiritually, emotionally, morally, and when you make it. When you climb out of whatever pit life threw you into, you reach back and pull someone else up, because that's what makes success meaningful. That's what makes wealth matter. That's what transforms a life into a legacy.